We have a huge Leafs update to go over today as a brand new report has dropped from Chris Johnson revealing that a sneaky Leafs signing is incoming and following what's going to be a crazy next few days for the Leafs. This new report reveals and outlines Brad Treliving's master plan going forward into the next few days as the draft inches closer and closer and as moves continue to happen across the NHL and with the Leafs. But before we get into it all, folks, if you're part of the percentage who aren't subscribed to the channel, this is the place to be for daily Leafs content. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you're a part of that 71%, you guys are fantastic. There's a lot to go over today, and obviously we're going to be talking about a player who is a little bit under the radar surrounding at least talks as it pertains to the Toronto Maple Leafs, and we haven't been talking about it too much until Chris Johnson came out and revealed some very interesting information. That player is very interesting. See here on First Up, Chris Johnson mentioned that the Leafs may pivot to Mikael Granlund, for example, if Tavares walks. And obviously, this is all kind of stemming from the fact that John Tavares, more closer and closer, seems like he's going to be, as free agency inch closer and closer, that is, rather seems he's going to be leaving. And not necessarily, I still think there's a good chance that Tavares stays, but talks are trending towards not necessarily him leaving, but it becoming more of a conversation. And because of that, Mikael Granlund has now entered the talks. CJ added that the Leafs and Tavares are so wide apart on money. If the Leafs go long term, that might help bridge the gap, but neither side is there yet. Both sides understand they'll have to move, and with a week before July 1st, Tavares is still more likely to re-sign than not. So this is very interesting. It seems the Leafs' next move has been revealed here, and might be one that's a little bit more surprising than a lot of us initially thought.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people had Granlund on the board for the Toronto Maple Leafs, but this could be a very sneaky good signing for the Toronto Maple Leafs, especially if Tavares is going out the door. Because, again, with the Tavares conversation and situation, we've talked about it ad nauseum at this point, and it seems like they're at a bit of a stalemate. There is a deadline coming up, so those obviously things get done before deadlines. But I think that it's going to be very interesting to see if John Tavares does end up walking for more money. Wouldn't necessarily blame him, because if he's going to stay a Leaf, he's going to be making far less than he would on the open market. But if he leaves, you have a huge gap in the center of the ice. If you're the Toronto Maple Leafs, you have Austin Matthews and then David Kampf and maybe Max Domi, if you want to consider him a center at this point, maybe Scott Laughton as well, but still, it's not looking great. That's my point. So you're going to have to go out and get another center. Mikael Granlund could make a ton of sense. He's put in great work with, obviously his time with the San Jose Sharks, but he was traded over to the Dallas Stars as well. Went on a little bit of a run in the playoffs with them, was a great player for them. He's very underrated physically as well. A lot of people, don't really think of him as a physical player, but he is. He's a little bit of a smaller player too, compared to some other, names out there, but he could be a really good option for the Leafs up the middle, especially at that 2C spot, and for, a dollar amount. And he's not, too old. He's also not the youngest guy, obviously just a couple years younger than John Tavares, but for a pretty reasonable dollar amount, if you get him for another maybe $5 million contract, $6 million to play your second line center, that can make a lot of sense for the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Yeah, you see at the bottom, his last contract was 4 years by 20, so $5 million a year. And maybe you can honestly similar contract. Now, I'm not saying sign him for 4 years necessarily, but he is 33 years old. He is a very, very solid player in a time where ultimately, John Tavares, I think the odds are still in the Leafs' favor for him resigning. But if he walks, which is becoming more of a possibility day by day here, it would be a very solid replacement and one that not necessarily cheaper, but I think probably shorter term. You see here, Vancouver is very interested in Matt Duchene, but he never wanted to leave Dallas. The heart wants more, the heart wants what the heart wants, but Dallas wanted to keep Mikael Granlund, but he's too much for Texas now. So it eliminates, of course, the team that traded for him. And for the Leafs, let's assume for sake of argument here that Tavares and Marner both walk, they have a ton of space available. Now, you just mentioned it. They have a ton of spots they need to fill, but these are the type of players where you can get them for fairly cheap, but they're very good players, and that they help, build out the full team. Again, we talked about it in our live stream yesterday. You add this in with a guy like, Brandon Tanev, Andrew Mangiapane. You're really starting to build out a team here now. Even bring Steven Lorentz back on the minimum or whatever it ends up being. You're talking about a guy and a team then, which is very solid. Now, he's horrible defensively, which, it is what it is. Offensively, aging a little bit. But on a 2-year deal, I don't know what the market is for him at this point. Let's say it's a 2-year, $10 million deal or something like that. Like, it's pretty solid, not a ton of risk here. And is he going to be as good as John Tavares? That's obviously the big question mark. But if Tavares decides to go elsewhere because of the money, this would be a good replacement. And even if Tavares stays, I could still see a case to be made for him to get on that third line.
Yeah, and I would imagine that I could see that case as well, although it would cost you quite a bit, but obviously it would lengthen your center depth and push a couple guys like Laughton to the wing, which I think could make a lot of sense for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But again, I think that horrible defensively. You have Austin Matthews. He's been a lot better defensively too. You have a guy like Scott Laughton, who's a great two-way player. So, if you put Granlund in the middle there with William Nylander, let's say, they're going to put up a ton of points together, or they should in theory. And I think that could be a really good match. And like you just brought up, his last contract was obviously 4 years by $5 million. I think that he'd probably be looking for something very similar. He's probably looking, because of his age, for like a 4-year contract. Obviously, if you could sign him to 1 or 2, that'd be fantastic. Obviously, very low risk, but he's probably looking like 4 or 5-year contract, something like that. And if it's in the $5 to $6 million range, I don't think that's too horrible for a guy who could, slot into your second line center position. Again, if you look at his point totals from last year too, very good on a San Jose Sharks team that wasn't great. And then obviously he moved over to the Dallas Stars, and that was obviously a lot better, but had a pretty good season. So this is a guy that I think can put up points for you. Each line, and Craig Berube is looking for an identity in each line. You can see contract projections there. They're not too, off from what he was making in his last contract. So Craig Berube likes each line to have an identity. So if the second line is high flying, go score goals, that's okay, because the first line is obviously, you want them to chip in for goals, maybe a little bit more defensively responsible. Then you have your third line for whatever it is. We don't know what it's going to look like at this point. You mentioned Mangiapane. I think he's definitely coming to the Leafs at this point too, but could be they have a couple really interesting options. And I think that Granlund, when you're looking at him as a replacement for Tavares, if Tavares goes out the door, it's probably going to be cheaper for what Tavares signs on the open market. And he could offer similar point production.
Yeah, and in case you missed it, here's the stats here. You can see there under his name: 22 goals, 44 assists. Put up 9 points less than John Tavares, I believe it was. Whatever John Tavares put up, it was I think 75 points last year. So it was a very good season for Tavares. But again, his cap it here, let's say it's $5.5 million over 2 or 3 years. I think you do that. You look at some of the comparables given the age, and most of them are actually lower than the projected cap. And the cap's going up, all these different things. I think between $5 and $6 million for Granlund would make a ton of sense. He also was pretty solid in the playoffs, and someone that just, again, the Leafs are trying to change their DNA, and they're trying to get different. If they want to completely change their DNA, let Marner walk, let Tavares walk. You replace Tavares with Granlund, similar player. Maybe some would argue they prefer Granlund as a player. Most people will probably prefer John Tavares as a player. Save a little bit of money, get all these other guys that we're talking about, Mangiapane, very likely, Brandon Tanev, his brother, plays here, really start to build out this team. And you can still have money left over then, especially if you're letting both Tavares and Marner walk, to make a push for Brad Marchand or Aaron Ekblad. And then, of course, go from there. You look at his postseason, really, really good. 13 games, 4 goals, and 7 points. And really, really good. Maybe not in the grand scheme of things, but for Toronto Maple Leafs playoff performance categories, that's pretty good. And especially given what we've been used to. So it's going to be very interesting, folks. Again, you look at the team, like they have so many holes to fill. I don't want to see Ryan Reeves. I don't want to see Jacob Quillen, nothing against him. Like David Camp, they're probably going to try to trade him. Probably not going to work. Nick Robertson, they're going to try to sign and trade. A lot of these guys are going to end up walking. It's going to be crazy to see what happens going forward. But folks, that'll wrap it up. Things are picking up. I think a sneaky move is going to be incoming for the Leafs, and we're going to keep you up to date every step of the way. So make sure to hit the subscribe button. Thank you guys for watching. See you later.